Why, hello, human geographers. I hope that you guys are doing well. It is time for us to take a look at Chapter 8, Political Geography. I want to start off by asking you the very first question that starts on page 238 in your textbook. And the question is, how many countries can you name? Pause for just a moment and see how many countries you can write down just off the top of your head. For most of us, we can't remember that many. We can probably remember the big ones, but sitting and looking at a map, the United States and Canada and Mexico, we know those because those are closest to us. But when it comes to European countries and Asian countries, most of us are not that familiar with them. In fact, as human geographers, you really need to know where most countries are located. We've had a lot of conflicts over the past years, but no one can predict where the next war is actually going to erupt. A political geography will help explain the cultural and physical factors that underlie some of the political unrest in the world. Hopefully in this chapter we'll be able to discover some of the reasons why we have some of the conflicts that we do. For most of human history, there have been wars and conflicts. There's very little time, year-wise, that we've actually not had any conflicts. In the 20th century, however, the time where your grandparents and your great-grandparents lived, we saw more conflict and death and destruction than we had seen in all of the previous centuries combined. We have World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and countless other conflicts that defined the 20th century. And in our century, it started off wonderfully in 2001 when on September 11th, we have the attack in New York City, Washington, D.C., that has really defined the early part of this century. But conflicts like this are not new. On page 240, you have the case study talking about changing borders in Europe. And it begins talking about Daniel Lenig. Daniel lives in a village, Ristershofen, and he works in the town of Worth, about 30 miles away at a truck factory. Well, he lives in France, he works in Germany. But to get from one to the other, the only thing that'll slow him down is traffic, because the borders are pretty fluid at that place. The boundary is pretty easy to cross between Germany and France. It's not always been that way. There's been places, regions like the Alsace and Lorraine regions that are spoken of here in the case study that had caused conflicts because of Germanic tribes that inhabited that area. Then it was annexed by France. And when Germany was defeated in World War I, everything was chopped up, which basically guaranteed there were going to be more conflicts in the future. And at the end of the Cold War, and the breakdown of communism, France and Germany lie now. What the book says is at the core of the world's wealthiest market area. Instead of focusing on these boundary disputes, the people decided to focus more on their own higher standard of living and making a better life for themselves. But although these old boundaries between France and Germany have been broken down, new ones have come up in Europe. You have challenges with Slovenia and Croatia and Lithuania and Russia as Eastern Europe has been broken up into smaller countries. But breaking up a country sometimes means you're breaking up families and traditions and local things that went on that now can't go on because they're under a new regime. These inherently cause conflicts. As we get into key issue 1, which is what this particular video is going to be about, we have to ask several questions. Where are states located? who determines, who defines those states? And how do you figure the sizes of the states? Some are huge. Some are 11% of the land on the planet, like Russia, and some are micro-states. We're going to be talking about those. And we're going to talk about the development of the state. We're going to talk about some history of this. When it comes to definitions, the problems of defining, when it comes to a state, which you need to know this definition, it's an area organized into a political unit ruled by an established government that has control over internal and foreign affairs. The whole idea here is that the government, the state, has sovereignty. That means it has independence from all other control by other states. It can pretty much make up its own mind what they're going to do and how they're going to run things. One of the states that the book talks about is Korea. We have North Korea and South Korea. Korea was a colony of Japan for a long time. It was divided by the United States and Russia after World War II. And it was divided along the 38th parallel. The division of the zones became permanent in the late 40s when these superpowers of the United States and Russia wanted to claim control over all of it, particularly Russia. The Democratic People's of Republic of Korea, this is North Korea, invaded South Korea, called the Republic of Korea. This led to a 3-year conflict. At the time, it was called a police conflict, where the United States, along with other UN nations, fought against the communist North Korea. At this time, there still exists a state of war between North and South Korea. They've made some reconciliations, but the tension is still really, really high. You'll have to take a look at the actual map on page 241, figure 8-1. You can see a night image of South Korea versus North Korea. You can notice that North Korea has almost no electric lights. Life in North Korea is very, very hard because the leaders of North Korea are very harsh over their people, and they do not give them a whole lot of freedom. They certainly don't give them, obviously, very many pluses like electricity. Other conflicts that have come up are between things like China and Taiwan. The question of whether or not it's one state or two. You consider China, officially the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan, officially the Republic of China, as separate and sovereign states. Taiwan, according to China, is not sovereign. It's a part of China. But it's confusing. A civil war in China during the late 1940s between the nationalists and the communists. After losing, the nationalists fled in 1949 to Taiwan, an island off the Chinese coast. The nationalists proclaimed that they were still the legitimate rulers of China, of all of China, until some future occasion when they could defeat the communists and recapture China, they could at least govern this island. So in 1999, Taiwan's president announced that Taiwan would regard itself as a sovereign, independent state. But China, obviously, is not going to accept that. Among all of the nations in the United Nations, Taiwan is the most populated state. There's also issues with Western Sahara, the Sahrawi Republic. It's called Western Sahara on our maps for the most part. It is considered by most people to be a sovereign state, but Morocco claims territory that it says it built a 2,700-kilometer wall around the territory to keep out rebels. Spain controlled the territory on the continent's west coast between Morocco and Mauritania until backing off in 1976. An independent Sahrawi republic was declared by the Polisario Front, and recognized by most African countries, but Morocco and Mauritania annexed the northern and southern portions. Well, 3 years later, Mauritania withdrew, and Morocco claimed all of it. They said it all belongs to us. So Morocco controls most of the populated area, but the Polisario Front operates in the vast, partially uninhabited deserts, or the inhabited deserts. Especially 1/5 of the territory lies east of Morocco's wall. Other areas like the polar regions. Who actually owns the South Pole? Antarctica. Who owns that continent that lies 14 million square kilometers, over 5.5 million square miles, almost half as large as Canada? Who owns that? You can see a figure 8-3 shows you how much of it is divided, but it's kind of still back and forth. In 1982, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea permitted countries to submit claims. By 2009, well, the Arctic region is thought to be rich in resources, so a lot of the countries on the planet are actually trying to claim portions of it. Only 40 some odd states have actually done something about it. As we move forward here, you can see this is a picture of Western Sahara. French soldier attached to the UN missions patrols of portions of the sand walls that were built by Morocco in the 1980s to isolate the Polisario Front rebels who were fighting for independence. It's kind of an interesting photograph. By the way, anytime you see a soldier with a blue hat like that, or a blue helmet, you can pretty much assume that belongs to the United Nations. Here you can see the national claims to the Arctic, which this really doesn't help you as much as the map on 8-3. It's kind of an interesting map. As you see the different countries, the UN members, when it was organized, in 1945, the United Nations only had 51 members, including 49 sovereign states. The greatest increase in sovereign states has really occurred in Africa. Only 4 African states were originally members of the UN: Ethiopia, Egypt, Liberia, South Africa. Only 6 more joined in the 50s, but in 1960, a collective of independent states carved out most of the remaining region. By the 1960 alone, 16 new African states became UN members. The creation of the sovereign states slowed in the 80s, but the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia stimulated the formation of new states in the 1990s. Several microstates in the Pacific Ocean even joined in the late 1990s. But the question lies, how big are some states? The largest, of course, has to be Russia. It's 11% of the world's land area. That's 6.5 million square miles. That is absolutely huge. Other states with more than 5 million square kilometers would be Canada, United States, China, Brazil, and Australia. But what about the smaller states? How about the smallest? Smallest is called Monaco. It's only about 1/2 square mile. It is called a microstate. There are dozens and dozens of these microstates all over the world. Most of them are actually islands, which explains their small size and their sovereignty. Well, how did all this start? Well, before the 1800s, the Earth's surface was organized in other ways, like city-states, empires, and tribes. But it all started, of course, we know this according to Scripture as well, in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. This all started in the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is a fertile land area that starts with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers over in modern-day Iran and Iraq. And it takes a left, goes west, and then to Assyria, and then south through Israel, all the way down into Egypt. And if you take a pencil and you draw it out on the map, it looks like a crescent moon. So that's why they call it the Fertile Crescent. The first states to evolve or to develop came in this area. A city-state is a sovereign state that comprises a town and the surrounding countryside. You will definitely need to know that. The earliest states that developed were called Sumeria, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. The longest lasting, of course, is Persia. It is modern-day Iran. You don't really want to go to Iran and call them Arabs. They will be a little upset with you. They declare themselves to be Persians. In fact, that's why they speak Farsi, which is what they consider to be their ancient Persian language. And that's in the northeastern part of this Fertile Crescent. In the far southwest, well, we have another very long-lasting empire called Egypt. From around 3000 BC until the 4th century BC. That's 2,600 years. We have a lot of biblical history that is centered down in that time period. To move on, early European states, political unity reached its height with the Roman Empire, which lasted until about the 400s AD, 476 to be exact. Romans were real good at monitoring and controlling a region of really most of Western Europe, and including some portions of North Africa and the Mediterranean, all the way down to Egypt and back. But they kind of broke up in the 400s, and new political entities came around. On the outskirts of the Roman Empire, you can still see, in fact, you can see in England, it's divided by a wall called Hadrian's Wall. It's done by a Roman commander by the name of Hadrian, who built this wall to say, all right, this is Roman territory to the south, anything to the north, well, those are barbarians. Well, they called them barbarians because the languages that they spoke was just gibberish to them. So they just said, well, they're barbarians. The words just sounded like mush to them, just bar, 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 bar. That's where we get the word barbarian from. Well, the European portion of the Roman Empire was fragmented after 476 into a large number of states owned by kings, dukes, barons, and other nobles. So around 1100, some of these kings emerged as rulers and began claiming larger portions of land, more than just their own little castle and the land surrounding it. Well, that's where we develop into countries like England and France and Spain. So much of Europe, notably present-day Germany and Italy, remained fragmented into large number of states and weren't consolidated until the 1800s. Now, how do states grow? How do they spread? Well, sometimes they do it by developing colonies. And that's a territory legally tied to a sovereign state rather than being completely independent. Several of the countries in from the 1400s on developed huge amounts of colonies. And this is what we call colonialism. It's an effort by one country to establish settlements or territories all over the globe to impose its political, economic, and cultural principles on that territory. Now, European states established these colonies for three basic reasons. You're going to need to know these. One, to promote their religion, primarily Christianity. And the second, to bring back some of the resources that Europe needed. And to establish relative power over these colonies. So it was about power and money and faith. These three motives can be summarized easily as God, gold, and glory, if you want to remember it with the letter G. It's a good way to remember it. The European colonization of Africa and Asia is often called imperialism. You'll need to know that term. That's a key word for this key issue. It's the control of territory already occupied and organized by an indigenous society, whereas colonialism is controlling a previously uninhabited or sparsely inhabited land. You need to know the difference between those two terms. And you do need also to remember that the British Empire, because of all of its imperialistic colonies and land holdings all over the globe, they said that the sun never set on the British Empire, which basically means you can't go to a continent that doesn't have some British-controlled territory somewhere. At one time, the colonies were widespread all over the earth, but right now, it's really only a handful. The U.S. Department of State lists only 43 colonies with indigenous populations. Most current colonies are off in the Pacific and Caribbean seas. The most populous is Puerto Rico. It's a commonwealth of the United States with 4 million residents, about 3,500 square miles. They're citizens of the U.S., but they can't participate in elections, and they do not have any representation in Congress. But that sounds a lot like what we had. We had taxation without representation. Sounds exactly like what Puerto Rico has. One of the world's largest populated colonies is Pitcairn Island. It's 18 square miles and belongs to the United Kingdom, to Great Britain. The island in the South Pacific was settled in 1790 by British mutineers from the ship Bounty, captained by William Bligh. You may know about this from the mutiny on the Bounty. This is where they actually ended up. Its 48 islanders survived by selling fish as well as postage stamps to collectors. The State Department does not include several inhabited islands considered by other sources to be colonies, but to be honest with you, you really don't need to know much of that. So I really wouldn't worry about that. That's the rest of Key Issue 1. Pay attention to it, make sure you read over it, and get ready for the Key Issue quiz coming up.